find the sum, -4 plus -7. Then we're going to find the product, -4 times -7. So let's see what we've got, and then we're going to think about our results a little bit. So if I have -4 plus -7, we're adding two numbers that have the same sign. So remember, when we're adding numbers with the same sign, our rule is to take the sum, add the two numbers together, and keep the sign. Add their absolute values and keep the sign. So since they're both negative, I know my answer is going to be negative. Remember, when we're adding, and then I take 4 and 7, that gives me 11. So my final answer is -11. Remember, that makes sense. If we think about being in debt, if we're in debt $4, so -4, and then I add more debt, I add -7, that's going to give me a total debt of -11. To find the product, though, our rules are different, right? When we multiply signed numbers, if I have a negative times a negative times a negative is a positive, and 4 times 7 is 28. So let's think about this. Many of us have heard the expression, a negative and a negative is a positive. Is this always true? Well, if we look at our examples up here, we say no, that's not true. In the first problem, we had two negative numbers, and my result was negative. In the second one, I had two negative numbers, and the result was positive. So we want to think about what would be a better way to say this so that we can avoid confusion and errors. Because if we think that a negative and a negative is always going to give us a positive, this first problem is always going to give us some trouble. So let's think of how to say this more clearly. Notice here it says a negative and a negative. Well, and is not an operation. Okay, we have to pay attention to what operation are we doing. Are we doing addition, subtraction, multiplication, division? It matters what the operation is. And itself is not an operation. So let's think of how we might say this differently. So for this first problem, what we want to think about is, well, I'm adding two negative numbers. And we know when we add two negative numbers, my result is always going to be negative. So let's be clear about the operation we're doing. So when we add two negative numbers, the result will always be negative, right? Because when we are adding two negative numbers, we're going to keep that same sign when we find their sum. But in our second problem, we weren't adding anymore, we were multiplying. So when we multiply, and this is also true for dividing, right? Or divide two negative numbers. Whoops, sorry about that. The result will always be what? Well, if I have a negative times a negative or a negative divided by a negative, the result is always going to be positive. So it's much clearer to not just say a negative and a negative. We have to be clear on what's our operation. If we're adding two negatives, my result will always be negative. But if I multiply or divide two negatives, the result will always be positive. And you might be wondering about, well, what about subtraction? Well, because we can always think about subtraction in terms of addition, this addition rule will take care of us for both addition and for subtraction.